Warning: the following content may be disturbing to some individuals. Consumer discretion is advised.
Sirens of the Supernatural.
We interrupt this program for the following special announcement.
UFO sightings, men in black, the frightening appearance of a mysterious creature, and a local tragedy that would reverberate into the heart of this nation. Hello, my name is Travis Shortt, and I'm going to lead you on an exploration into the unknown. Together we're going to examine the appearance of the Mothman and other seemingly inexplicable events that occurred in and around the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the late 1960s. We're going to examine the lives that were immediately and forever altered by the appearance of this creature that would become known as the Mothman, and how this appearance affected the people and community of this typical American town.
Good evening, listeners. This is Rhonda with Sirens of the Supernatural, here with a very special guest, Travis Shortt. Hi, Travis.
How are you this evening?
Very well. Thank you for being with us and coming on to enlighten our listeners about a subject that is close to our hearts and our location, Mothman. And first of all, I'm going to introduce you and let our good listeners know a little bit about who you are and what you do. Travis Shortt is a Virginia native, so shout out. Woo-hoo. He is founder of Phoenix Publicity Promotions and Public Relations, holds a degree in communication from the University of Virginia's College at Wise, and pursued a master's degree in theology from Masters International School of Divinity. He also served as executive producer, host, narrator, and writer, along with Matthew Fleming, on the first feature documentary on the topic of Mothman. It's called Dark Wings, the Mothman Chronicle. And I believe there was a sequel, Dark Wings 2, The Dark Messenger. And from 2006 to 2009, Travis says you've served as featured speaker at the Mothman Festival, addressing the spiritual and religious implications of the Mothman sightings.
I did.
This sounds really super interesting. All of this sounds really interesting to me. So before we dive into more Mothman specific info, I wanted to ask you what first sparked your interest in the paranormal?
Fun story. So my dad was a coal miner in Virginia, and he worked evening shift and night shift quite a bit. And on Friday nights, when he would come home from the evening shift, which was basically 3 to midnight, CBS at that time, 3 networks back in the day, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, if you wanted to get really, really crazy. But he would come in on Friday nights, and CBS would run CBS Late Night. And typically they would run back-to-back films, horror films, or something like that. But occasionally they would also run one of my favorite TV shows from the 1970s, which is called Kolchak the Night Stalker. And it's about a news reporter in Chicago who worked for an independent news service, or INS. And he was always getting these very boring assignments to go out and cover hospital remodels or things along those lines. But every story that he was given always ended up turning into this supernatural paranormal mystery. And there was always this really bizarre creature that was associated. There was a werewolf in one episode. There was a vampire. There was a zombie. They even brought in Parmalfe, which is a New Orleans, Louisiana kind of swamp booger man kind of thing. So it was just a fun show. Darren McGavin did a great job. And actually, it's the show that inspired Chris Carter to create the X-Files. So it was that was sitting up late on Friday nights, watching that with my dad when he would come home, and we would fix snacks and we would sit there and we'd watch an episode. And then basically, a horror film would come on. And that's one of the reasons to this day that I'm a huge horror fanatic. I just love watching horror films. One of the first that I ever saw was The Omen. We watched that on CBS late night as a first run on television after it had been in the theaters. So that's kind of what gave rise to my interest in the paranormal and the supernatural. And then just, the older I got, the more I read, the more I watched, I really became intrigued with UFOs and with the Bermuda Triangle, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. All of those typical supernatural elements became really, really important to me. And I began researching and doing as much investigation as I possibly could. And lo and behold, years later, when I'm in my late 20s, early 30s, I end up working on this project, which was all kinds of fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect lead into the next question. What inspired you to do that deep dive into the Mothman phenomena?
How much time you got? That's a long story.
That was a brief story.
No, so you mentioned my background being marketing public relations. Well, from 1998 to 2003, I was the managing partner of an advertising agency called Adventure Media. We had our corporate office was in Norton, Virginia, but we opened a satellite office. We merged with a company called Quantum Source Networks, or QSN. So they were in Las Vegas. So we became Adventure QSN in Las Vegas. We were Adventure Media in Virginia. So my business partner at the time, Charlie McCracken, who worked with me and Matthew Fleming on the Dark Wings documentary, he and I would take trips out to Las Vegas about twice a year, April and October. And our very first trip out happened to be in October. And we realized that we were really close to Rachel, Nevada, which is where Area 51 is. So we decided to take a trek up to Area 51. And so we drove about a 90-minute drive. I think it's northwest of Las Vegas, if I'm not mistaken. It might be northeast. I can't remember now. But we got up there, enjoyed that location. So that became kind of our new hangout. And when we would go to Vegas, we would do our meetings, and then we would drive to Rachel. And on one of those trips, we stopped at the Area 51 Research Center. Do not let the name fool you. It was nothing of that magnitude. It was basically a Silver Eagle trailer van RV from the 1960s, 1970s. And it was full of books and magazines and pictures and paraphernalia and all sorts of things, all related to the paranormal and the supernatural. We happened to pick up a book by Jerome Clark, who is a fairly well-known researcher into Fortean events. And that's a word that'll come up a lot when we talk about Mothman. But he had this book where he outlined, I think it was 365 stories from all over the country that you could read a story every day and you would get introduced to a new supernatural or paranormal event. So we grabbed that book, and I was driving back from Rachel. Charlie was in the passenger seat, and he's flipping through and he's reading chapters, and he gets to one called The Mothman. And so he flips to that one because it was listed under the state of West Virginia. So Jerome had also broken it down by state and things like that. So Charlie's reading this as I'm driving, and we realize that, they're talking about West Virginia. And of course, we're in southwestern Virginia, and that's nestled between West Virginia and Kentucky and North Carolina and Tennessee. And so we're like, okay, we're going to have to figure out where this place is so that we can figure out how far away and if we could ever actually make a trek there. So we got back to the hotel, we looked it up and realized that it was about 3 hours from where we were living at the time. So we just kind of put this check beside, and it's like, if we ever get the chance, we're going to make a day trip up to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Well, fast forward, that was 1999, 2000. And actually it was 2000, maybe 2001, actually, now that I think about it, because it was the year that the Mothman Prophecies movie with Richard Gere and Laura Linney had just come out. And that was one of the other things that had intrigued us when we were flipping through the book. So you fast forward a couple of years, 2003, we sold the advertising agency. Both of us kind of took different paths. But we decided to continue doing creative projects that we were passionate about, that we found interesting. That way we could keep ourselves occupied. So in 2003, we're shooting a small marketing film for this little Christian college in Ashland, Kentucky. And when we finished the shoot, we stopped at this gas station. We were picking up some drinks and snacks for the drive back. And Charlie always had this thing of picking up road maps back when those were a really big thing. He loved road maps and trying to see what was in the neighboring area. And we realized at that point we were less than an hour and a half from Point Pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, both of us were married. We called the wives, like, we're not coming home tonight. We're taking a detour. We drove to Point Pleasant, met people there, and really just kind of fell in love with the locals and the community and the history. And we just really got to know a lot of great people. Ironically, when we stopped in that day at the tourism center, they didn't want to talk about Mothman at all. And they said, if you want to talk about Mothman, go on Main Street. There's a bunch of crazy people over there that'll be more than happy to talk to you. That's exactly what they said. So being us, we went to find the crazy people. And we had great fun. We met Jeff Walmsley, who authored Mothman Behind the Red Eyes. We met Carolyn Harris, owner of Harris's Steakhouse. We met Charlie Humphreys, who was the director of economic development for the city of Point Pleasant and for Mason County. We met Denny Bellamy, who was the director of tourism. Later, he became the director of tourism. That's when things kind of changed a whole lot, and he actually embraced Mothman and things like that. We really made these connections with people, got to talking to them and hearing their stories. And it was just kind of this kind of fun thing. So we're like, you know what? We really want to do a documentary and look not only at the supernatural and the paranormal side, but to look at the psychological, sociological, and economic impact that the sightings and the collapse of the bridge had on the town of Point Pleasant. And that's kind of how we got thrown into it in 2003. It took us 6 years to complete the documentary because we were funding it ourselves, and we were working jobs. So it was myself, it was Charlie McCracken, and it was my cousin, Matthew Fleming. And Matthew at the time was employed, or still is, but was employed in a different capacity. I was the director of marketing and public relations for a hospital. Charlie was running his own production company. And so we were all doing our own things. This was a hobby, but it was a hobby that sucked up 6 years of our lives, thousands of dollars, countless trips to Point Pleasant. But at the end of the day, we had the pride and the joy of creating the first feature-length documentary film. There had been segments about Mothman, 30-minute segments, 15-minute segments, things like that, but nothing of a feature length, which is anything over 60 minutes. So we decided to stretch it and try to do something that would fall into that feature-length category, and with eyewitness interviews, historical context, and then the CGI recreations and things like that.
Wow. Sounds like y'all were really dedicated doing this in your free time on your own dime.
Dedicated, crazy, delusional. I don't know. There's a couple of different terms that have been used.
Wow. That's an interesting story, and how that all came about. I want to talk a little bit about what the Mothman creature supposedly looks like. When we're on live with our listeners this Friday night, we're going to talk more about that and about some other things. But as I've watched you on other podcasts and read books and researched about the creature, they say that has about a 10-foot wingspan, glowing red eyes. It's a humanoid-like creature, tall, slender. I believe one of the witnesses said tall, slender, yet muscular man with angel-like wings that were ashen in color. Yes. Can you add anything about the Mothman's description that you've learned from the people that saw it?
Not really anything that I can add. I always try to clarify when I'm on shows. You know, the term Mothman was actually dubbed by the Associated Press because at the time, sightings were 1966 to 1967. The Adam West Batman TV series was very popular at that time. And in the Batman comics, there's also a character, Mothman. And so that was where this AP news reporter grabbed that particular term and it stuck. And it's a shame that it stuck because it doesn't really, I mean, it's fun. It's great to toss around and play with, but it doesn't do justice to what these eyewitnesses saw. There was nothing insect-like about this creature. There was nothing moth-like about it. As you said, and the eyewitness that gave that description is Linda Scarberry, and that she and her husband Roger and the Millette couple were the original 4 eyewitnesses on November 13th of 1966. I'm sorry, November 15th of 1966, which we got an anniversary on that first sighting coming up in a couple of weeks.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So it's November 15th of 1966, and then December 15th, 1967 was the collapse of the Silver Bridge.
Right.
But the report, the account that you're reading is what Linda relayed to the police and to other investigators since then, and especially to our film crew when we were there, because that was one of the things we wanted to get actually on film was her own words, what she saw. And once again, some 40 years later when we were interviewing her, she still had that description that it was a humanoid bipedal entity.
Mm-hmm.
And I always use the term entity as opposed to creature because, and that's one of those things that goes back to some of the presentations that I've done in the past, some of the books that I've contributed to and things like that. 7 to 9 feet tall, as you mentioned, a 10 or possibly even 15-foot wingspan. Slender yet muscular, ashen in color, and had angel-like wings protruding from its back. And I always have just jumped onto that description because there's so many ways she could describe wings other than angel wings. She could have said eagle's wings. If it were a bat-like, and she could have said bat wings. She could have said moth wings. She did not. She chose the term angel wings. And the other eyewitness accounts, and this is something that I brought up in one of my presentations there at the Mothman Festival, there are what many people would call discrepancies because some people say it's 6 feet tall, some people say 9 feet tall, some people say it's gray, some people said it was black, some people would claim that it was wearing something akin to a tunic. Some people said that it had no clothes on at all. But there were always some similarities that never changed. Height, it was massive in height. I'm 6'2". Charlie McCracken was 6'7". So I mean, for most people, those are tall. That's a substantial height. So the height was always pretty much between 6 and 9 feet. You could pretty much guarantee that was the height you were going to get. The second thing that you were always going to hear were the wings. And that they were massive and that they were very much like angel wings. And the third thing that you always heard were the red glowing eyes. And some individuals would account that, they felt like the eyes were drawing them to this entity. Some people felt like they never used the term possessed, but they were losing control of themselves, that they were almost being hypnotized by these red glowing eyes. So those three commonalities have always occurred across all of the eyewitness accounts in Point Pleasant, and they have occurred in other cultures across the world.
Mm-hmm.
That led me to actually posit a theory back in, I think it was 2007. I don't think I posited it in the first presentation. I believe it was 2007. Is that, and one of the reasons that I say this is because there were multiple sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the surrounding counties, and many of those sightings were going on simultaneously. Calls were coming in from different parts of the county with people claiming to have seen the same thing. And again, you have to remember, this was 1966. This was very rural West Virginia. Phones were not always readily available. There definitely were no cell phones. There definitely were no, if you had a camera, it was one of those that you had to take the picture, you had to take it and have it developed. You had to wait for it to get developed. They had to send it back to you. All of those fun things that some of us have grown up with. So to have multiple sightings all going around at the same time about something that really hadn't made the news yet. This was all taking place between November of 66 and December of 67. And it was really after the collapse of the bridge that the Mothman story blew up. I say all that to say this, that I posited that it's very possible that what was taking place in Point Pleasant was not Mothman, but Mothmen, that there were multiple entities that were manifesting themselves
More than one
around Point Pleasant at the same time. And that could account for the simultaneous multiple sightings, but it also accounts for the discrepancies or the so-called discrepancies in eyewitness accounts.
Right. Wow. I really land on the theory that I heard you speak on another podcast about the theory and what Linda Scarberry described as angel wings. And some theories about the entity say that it could be a fallen angel, a demon, an extraterrestrial, or even a Nephilim, which, for our listeners, that's an offspring resulting from the coupling of fallen angels and human women that's described in the Bible in the book of in the book of Genesis. And the angels who have wings, there are many descriptions of angels in the Bible, the hierarchy of angels and all of that. And seraphim actually means fiery serpent.
Yes.
Um, Tell us what you believe about this entity's origins. Do you think it could somehow be connected to a hierarchy of angelic beings or a demon that can take multiple forms? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, if you, and you've obviously listened to some of my other podcasts, my theories have changed and evolved over the years, and I'm not ashamed to say that. When we went to Point Pleasant, we were struck by several things, and it's actually very similar to what took John Keel, who wrote the Mothman Prophecies. And I encourage you, if you haven't read that one yet, pick that up and read it. Also, make sure you have plenty of time to read it. It's not necessarily a thick book, but it's not narrative in any form or fashion. He jumps around. It's more like a journal. He's journaling what he's thinking about at the time. But Keel didn't go to Point Pleasant looking for Mothman. Keel went to Point Pleasant to do some research on UFO sightings, possible men in black, and things like that. And then when he got there, he found out, like we did, and talking to people and researching, that during this same time frame, you had Mothman being seen in and around Point Pleasant. There were animal mutilations, some cattle, some dogs. You had UFO sightings. You had men in black. You had poltergeist activity. You had occult activity supposedly going on in the TNT area, covens and groups that were practicing black magic and Satanism and things like that. So all of this stuff was taking place. And, actually, West Virginia was just a hopping place of the paranormal in the 1960s. It wasn't just Mothman. It had Indrid Cold off in Mineral Springs, West Virginia. You had the Flatwoods Monster in Flatwoods, West Virginia. So all this was taking place around the same time. And then actually, Indrid Cold definitely was taking place around the same time. Flatwoods Monster was taking place a few years earlier. But even in our research, to digress just one second, we traced Mothman sightings back to the early 1960s, before 1966. There were eyewitness accounts of a mother and son who saw what they claimed was an angel in their barn. There were some grave diggers who were digging a grave, and they saw this same winged entity just lift off the ground. They said it was like watching a helicopter take off without the propellers spinning around. It just kind of floated up in the air, flapped its wings, and then flew off. Wow. So all this stuff was kind of taking place. So when we went there, of course, you mentioned it in my bio that I had pursued a master's degree in theology from Master's International School of Divinity. I had served at one point in my life as a pastor and as a minister. I was a chaplain for sheriff's department. I was a chaplain for a hospital. So I had a lot of experience in the spiritual and the religious side of things. So everything that I was hearing there led me to believe that what we were possibly looking at was a fallen angel or a Nephilim. And it actually made me reach out to a good friend of mine now, Dr. L.A. Marzulli, who wrote a series of fiction books called the Nephilim Trilogy, but it's all based in reality. And he has gone on to create a series of DVDs called the Watchers DVD series, where he delves into this whole theory of the Nephilim in other cultures and other worlds. And I tie that in because when you look at, as you mentioned, the seraphim, there are 9 choirs of angels in Judeo-Christianity, and that falls in from the Jewish standpoint of angels and the Christian standpoint of angels. And there's several of those choirs that I think fit certain supernatural paranormal phenomena. There's the one group of angels that are described as wheels. They're round, they're circular, they're full of eyes, and they fly across the heavens. Sounds a lot like a UFO to me. Sounds a lot like something that people have described. And especially when a lot of the eyewitnesses for UFOs have mentioned that the shell or the skin of a UFO is very much like that. It's skin-like. It's malleable, and it reforms and retakes its shape. And then the seraphim are another one. And you mentioned that they are, that term actually does mean fiery serpent. And there are other definitions would also, or translations would say it means winged fiery serpent, that these are fiery serpents that have wings. One of the parts of my presentation in Point Pleasant was always the religious and spiritual connotations that these winged messengers bring. And every culture across the world and every religion has winged entities in it. You look at Sumeria, look at Babylon, look at Egypt with the Sphinx. You look at Judeo-Christianity, look at Hinduism, look at Mesoamerica. You look at the Mayans and the Aztecs. They had Quetzalcoatl, who was the winged serpent who brought knowledge from the skies. And so when you start looking at this common thread that seems to span eons of time, and it spans cultures and it spans religion and race and all of that, there begins to start taking form this tapestry that I think we have to take a closer look at. And so when I approached it early on, I was looking at it solely from a religious standpoint, not just from Judeo-Christianity, but I was looking at it from every possible culture that I could. And that was what got me interested in talking with Dr. Lynn Marzulli. And so we had developed, you mentioned Dark Wings to The Dark Messengers, which was a sequel that we were working on. And that was going to be a joint project that Lynn and I were going to do. And the plan was to bring together a Christian minister, regardless of denomination, to bring together a Jewish rabbi, to bring together an imam from the Islamic faith, to bring together a Native American shaman, to bring other indigenous religious leaders in and do kind of a panel discussion on this and break it down and talk and find out what other people think and what other people feel. Now, that was 2009, 2010. There's a gap between 2013 and where we are today. And so that documentary never got off the ground. And Dark Wings, the documentary itself, actually kind of got pulled for a little while. Charlie McCracken and I, we had a falling out, and he owned the rights to the film because he done the footage. I owned the rights to the script because I wrote it. I did the research with Matthew Fleming. So we could never come to any kind of agreement or arrangement. So basically the documentary was pulled for a little while. Well, unfortunately, Charlie passed away in 2019, but we had the opportunity to speak and to kind of make amends and work through things, but he died very suddenly. And so upon his death, his widow has given me all of that footage and all the rights back to the original documentary. So I'm in the process of working on trying to get that film reintroduced to the public. And actually, I want to reintroduce the one that we released in 2009. And then I also want to do an extended version because there were lots of things that we cut out. And I also want to include a piece that is a tribute to Charlie's memory. And I want to interview Matthew, and I want to be interviewed, and we're going to interview his widow and his kids and do this nice little in memoriam piece that will be a part of that DVD. But over the years, I also began talking to individuals like Lon Strickler, who has Phantom and Monsters podcast and 40 online magazine. And we've talked. I've been on his show many times. I co-hosted a show with Bill Bean, the deliverance minister, spiritual warrior. We had Lon on our show many times, and we always ended up talking about Mothman because Lon is following modern sightings a lot more than I do. I try to stay on top of the newer sightings, but my emphasis and my focus has always been on the Point Pleasant sightings, those kind of the origin story, going back, because there's still kernels that we haven't really uncovered there because there's so many layers and so much depth to that particular story. But Lon has actually been following these new winged humanoid sightings in and around Chicago, and especially the Chicago O'Hare Airport. And these have been going on for almost a decade now, and they're up into the thousands of these sightings. And Lon and his group of researchers have actually been in contact with these entities, and they have communicated with them. And so Lon and I have gotten into this really, these deep conversations about are they demonic? Are they ultra terrestrial? Because that was a term that John Keel had used early on. He just thought, he didn't think that they were extraterrestrial. He thought they were from this terrestrial domain, but from another parallel dimension, and that only certain people who were vibrating at certain frequencies could see them, and they could only be seen by other people at certain times, either through heightened anxiety or other environmental factors that might be impacting those individuals. So over the years, I've kind of changed my perspective, and I don't want to pigeonhole myself or these original sightings and say, yes, it was demonic, yes, it was evil, yes, it was a Nephilim or something like that. I've kind of opened my mind up a little bit more, and I'm being a little bit more objective than I originally was when we started the investigation.
Wow. I have heard about some of the modern sightings. I went down a rabbit hole when I was researching this because it sucks you in.
Nice.
And you want to find out more. The more you know, the more you want to find out. And let's talk about this for a second.
Okay.
When you went to Point Pleasant, many of the locals believe that the entity made its home at what you referred to before as the TNT area.
Yes.
I want to explain to our listeners a little bit about what that area is. And from what I've read, and you can please, add your 2 cents here, that it was a vacant nuclear power plant site outside of the town of Point Pleasant. Like a munition site was built there. It was occupied, but it was shut down in a few short years during World War II. Is that correct?
It was not a nuclear power plant. It was there was a north power plant and a south power plant. So I don't know how far you went down the TNT rabbit hole, but it gets really bizarre. So in the 1940s, of course, we were at the height of World War II. So the U.S. government was building military installations in civilian populations to get as far away from prying enemy eyes, and most of them were in very rural settings. It's one of the reasons, the bomb was tested in white sands. They didn't want prying eyes to be able to see what was going on. Well, the TNT was actually the official name is the McClintock Wildlife Preserve, and it's about 800 to 1,000 acres. And so in the 40s, this organization, this construction company went in, and they built basically a small city there. And there were acid vats. There were, like I said, a north power plant on the north end. There was a south power plant. It was providing power all over this grid. They built igloos out there, not made of ice, not for Eskimos, but the shape of an igloo. There's these dome-shaped containment facilities, and then those domes were then covered with sod and even some small trees and things like that, so that they would blend into the landscape. If an enemy aircraft actually flew overhead, they would not be able to see what was there. All of these igloos, and many of them still stand today. I've been in several of them, but they stored different types of munitions, and this particular facility was known for the manufacturing of trinitrotoluene, or TNT, which is where the name TNT area comes from. You do not have any idea how many times I had to practice saying trinitrotoluene, and how many times I had to say it in retakes. And sometimes I think Charlie made me do it multiple times just to watch me get upset. So I love saying it now because now I've learned how to say it. But that's kind of where the name comes from, the TNT. The power plants were just electrical power plants, and then Mothman was actually sited at the North Power Plant. Now that was in the 1940s. Well, all of this was taking place, and in just a couple of years, this facility was built, was operational, and then was completely shut down and abandoned by the government. And now it's been overgrown, it's been overtaken, it's been reclaimed by nature. So all of these structures a lot of these structures are still there. They've just been grown over. They've been taken over by nature. You could be walking down a path and all of a sudden end up with an empty, igloo standing there with the door open.
Wow.
Actually, in 2010, one of the igloos blew up during the Mothman Festival because it still contained munitions, and something happened. and set it off, and it actually exploded. And that's why they actually, for years, they did a hayride during the Mothman Festival, and they kind of stopped that for a while. I think they've started it back. I don't know. But it's a really interesting kind of place. But the really interesting story, and we could never get anyone to come on camera. They were still scared, even to this day, to talk about it. But the government came in, created it. They hired locals, and they would pick the locals up in a school bus with blacked out windows. And see if any of this sounds familiar. And they would drive the locals to the TNT. They would drive into a garage. Everybody would get off the bus. They would the guys would go one way, the women would go another. They would go change out of their civilian clothes into work clothes. Get back on the bus. The bus would then take them in the blacked out windows and drop everybody off at different locations. They would work their shift. Bus would pick them up, blacked out windows, bring them back. They would get off the bus, put on their civilian clothes, get back on the bus, be taken back in town. Had no idea where they had been, had no idea where they were working at the facility. And it sounds a lot like the way that Area 51 has been described. When people were working at Area 51, they were picked up on a bus, blacked out windows, they were taken to the facility, they did their work. It's all very similar. Well, when we were there interviewing some of the not just eyewitnesses to Mothman, but eyewitnesses to all of the events that make up Point Pleasant, we had several individuals that would talk about having worked there, or their parents had worked there, or whatever. And Denny Bellamy was the only person who would go on record, and he, as I said, he was the director of tourism at the time. So Denny goes on record saying that, in just a little bit of the research he had done, what he found out was that this government contracting group had built the TNT area. They then had gone and built Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where there is a nuclear reactor. That was the same company that built that. And then they went out west and they built something called Groom Lake, which is the official name of Area 51. So there's really interesting Area 51, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Point Pleasant, Virginia connection by this particular construction company that was doing this. Now, I say all that to say this too. Yes, the TNT area was thought by many to be the home of the Mothman. People would go try to hunt him. They would go try to see him. John Keel went out there many times trying to see if he could see Mothman.
Wow. I knew our listeners would like that little side note about Area 51. It just seems strange.
A little bit.
Yeah. Well, when you went and you spoke with Linda Scarberry and some of the others who saw the entity in that time frame between 1966 and 1967, what are some things that stood out to you about their testimonies, about what they gave as their eyewitness accounts?
There's a couple of things, and I'm glad you asked that question. Not everybody asks that question. And for us, when we were doing this documentary, that was one of the components we wanted to capture, was the humanity of the story. Yes, it's got a fun supernatural paranormal side to it, and that's what everybody focuses on. But not just the eyewitnesses, but the lives that were lost when the bridge collapsed. 46 people died that night on December 15th. 2 of those bodies were never found, and they were dragging bodies out of the Ohio River for over 6 months. They kept dragging it and finding bodies, and that's a different part of it, of the same story. But that's what there's this humanity and this humanness to the story that is often overlooked, and we wanted to try to recapture some of that. The other thing was the tenacity of human nature. Here's a town that in the 1960s was about 5,000 people. Well, it's about 5,000 people now. It's never grown. It's never gotten any bigger, but it's never died and gone away. And I'll come back and talk about what happened in that when we talk about the bridge collapse. But what I did notice with Linda especially is that she never changed her story. Not one time. Everything that she said to us, she had said in other interviews. It never wavered. It never changed. It was always true to word. And that was the same way with all of the eyewitnesses. The other thing I found very interesting about the eyewitnesses is that, a lot of times when you investigate these types of things, and especially if you're approaching it from a journalistic standpoint, which was one of the things I brought to the table. And Matthew brought kind of a scientific, because he had a degree in environmental science, and Charlie brought the filmmaker. So there were these, three very different, but at the same time, very objective professions that we were coming wanting to get answers, not provide answers. And one of the things I found interesting is that how many of these original eyewitnesses we had to beg to tell their story. They weren't contacting us to tell the story. We were having to track them down and begging. And for example, Roger Scarberry, Linda's husband, has never one time told his side of the story. He's never gone on record. He has never talked about it. We negotiated countless times with him to come on record, let us interview him, tell his story. And our offer to him was, we would leave at this time we were shooting on digital cassette. We were going to leave the cassette with him. And if he ever wanted it told, he could send it back to us. But we just thought it was important for the posterity of the story, for his version of what happened that night to be told. He would not do it. There were several other witnesses that wouldn't talk about it. Linda did. And this is one of the things that kind of surprised me about Linda. We interviewed Linda in 2004 or 2005. And she met us at the Mothman Museum on Main Street in Point Pleasant. And at the time, as I mentioned, I was married, Charlie was married, but I was driving my wife and I at the time had a Honda Odyssey minivan, great van, still love. I would probably still drive that van. It was not what you would think of normally in a minivan. But we were in the minivan. I was driving. Charlie was in the passenger seat. Linda and her daughter and son-in-law were in the middle row. And Linda, we'd been talking to her. She was laughing and joking, and we had a good time. And we got in the van and we drove from Point Pleasant. It's about 10 miles, maybe 12 miles, to the TNT with the original sighting location. And what I noticed was I'm looking in the rearview mirror as I'm driving, and Linda is slowly just kind of folding in on herself. And she just starts rocking back and forth. And the closer we get to the TNT, the more catatonic she has become. She's not talking anymore. She's not laughing anymore. She's not engaged anymore. We get to the TNT. We pull up to the site of the North Power Plant, which no longer stands. It's now the Mason County Fairgrounds. They put the county fairgrounds where the North Power Plant used to be. But we pulled up there, and I open the doors, and I get out. Charlie gets out, and Linda's daughter and son-in-law get out, but Linda doesn't. She just stays in the back seat. And it took us several minutes to coax her and get her out. And this was in the middle of summer. And Point Pleasant is a river town, so it's always hot. It's humid. It's miserable, as a matter of fact. But she was shaking. She was shivering. I mean, she was acting like she was cold. And it was just the more we watched her, the more we realized that she was actually terrified to be back there. And so Charlie was getting set up for the interview, and he told me to try to comfort Linda in some form or fashion so that we could actually get the interview. So you'll actually see in the documentary, there's a scene where she and I are walking the fairgrounds. There's a fence. We're inside the fence, and we're just walking and we're just talking. And that's what I'm doing. Charlie had actually filmed it while I was just talking to her. We talked about everything. We talked about her marriage to Roger, the divorce. We talked about her kids. We talked about school. We talked about her career. We talked about everything. And finally, she opened back up, and we were able to get the interview, and it worked. But that was a very long, arduous process just to get her to talk. And that's one of the things that I noticed about the eyewitnesses is these people, they never, they might have gotten infamous for the eyewitness sighting, but they never got famous. They never made any money off of it. They were never, right. They never became rich. They didn't do this for the fun of it. They were ridiculed. They were made fun of. They lost their jobs. They lost their marriages. Many of them spiraled into alcoholism and drug abuse. Many of them have died. Linda died in 2010, as a matter of fact, 2010 or 2011. I remember I was living in Clintwood at the time. think it was 2010 actually. But she passed away. And it's just, you look at all these people and what they endured and what they went through, and yet they will still tell their story if they believe it's for a good cause, if they believe that, and if they believe that people are listening to them and not trying to tell their version of their story for them.
Right. Not sensationalizing it, or
Exactly.
and it wasn't just regular people there that saw it. There were teachers, doctors,
Police officers.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were over 100 eyewitness accounts
Wow.
in the first, in that first span between November and December. November 66, December 67. But yeah, I mean, school teachers, librarians, police officers, doctors, people that were known professionals, that were known and respected in the community, but they were seeing the same thing that these teenagers in the TNT area had seen.
That's so interesting, and it lends a lot of validity to the sightings as
Yes.
well. I know that we mentioned about talking about the bridge collapse, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, and I had read somewhere that the collapse of the bridge was 13 months to the day after their first official report that was made by Linda Scarberry and her friends.
That is correct. Yes.
And so this bridge, just to tell our listeners a little bit about it, it carried U.S. Route 35 over the Ohio River and connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis. Is that how you say that? Ohio?
Gallipolis.
Gallipolis. Okay.
Gallipolis. Yeah. And trust me, there's a funny story about how I learned how to pronounce that one too.
Okay. So the bridge collapsed during rush hour. 46 people killed, 2, like you said, whose bodies were never found. And I read somewhere that someone had seen both men in black the days before the bridge collapsed. Men in black were in the town, mysterious people. And then that there had been someone saw the Mothman entity on or near the bridge before the collapse.
That
Can
is
you
correct.
talk about that?
Both of those are eyewitness accounts. I've heard them for many years. We were never able to track down who it was that made those eyewitness accounts, but that sorry, excuse me. We were never able to figure out who it was that had made those, but both of those things were said, that men in black were seen underneath the bridge the day before. And the eyewitnesses that made this account say that, look, that they were investigating, that they were examining or whatever. And then there was the sighting of Mothman flying off of the bridge seconds before the collapse, followed by what many described as a sonic boom, that there was this massive explosion sound. And then the bridge, which was a suspension bridge, basically. And one of the eye wires and the rods that holds the eye wire snapped on one end. And when it did that, the bridge began to, as the eyewitnesses mentioned, it began to undulate like a snake. It just began to go up and down and up and down. And then eventually it collapsed and plunged all of these cars. Because what happened was the stoplights malfunctioned at either end of the bridge. So on the east-west direction of the bridge, both ends of the bridge had red lights. So both lanes of traffic totally backed up bumper to bumper. And then in those moments, there was the boom, the bridge collapsed, 46 people died. And as I said, we went to the local newspaper there, the Point Pleasant Register. We went into their morgue to look at old news stories starting with November 13th of 66 through December 15th of 67. But then we had to keep going because it was, as I mentioned, months into 1968, and they were still having funerals of the bodies that had been pulled out of the Ohio River. And then you started looking at how the fact that that bridge collapse made international news. It was being reported in the UK. It was being reported in Japan. It was being reported in Australia and Ireland, and all over the world. People were talking about this bridge collapse because at that time, for this country, it was the single worst bridge disaster in U.S. history, and actually, it is what prompted the Eisenhower administration to actually shut down bridges all over the country and actually inspect them to make sure that the bridges were up to speed and that they were up to code. And so there were, there were things that happened that were brought into play that have had positive impact on the country as a whole. But for such an event, for such a tragedy, and another interesting thing is almost every state in the country was represented by somebody who died on that bridge.
Oh, wow.
So it was this very, very jolting kind of realization. And another jolting realization that we came to as we were doing the research is, it wasn't just Mothman and the collapse of the bridge, but for such a small town, this town has its rich history of tragedy going back, hundreds and hundreds of years. And we even do a timeline in the documentary film of the disasters and the tragedies that have occurred from the colonial times all the way up to 2001. Actually, we tracked it up to 2001 because we found an interesting 9/11 tie-in with Point Pleasant. That is the airplane that was hijacked and flown into the Pentagon. According to FAA flight plans, it was hijacked directly above Point Pleasant, West Virginia. If you look at the FAA map,
Right?
so
Yeah.
it was hijacked there. It made a trajectory change, flew back to Washington D.C. and flew into the side of the Pentagon.
And there was a report and maybe a picture that was somewhere circling the internet about someone seeing a winged humanoid creature flying between the two towers.
Twin Towers, yes, that image has been circulating for many years. We don't have the original, obviously, but we have taken what has circulated around the internet. We've had several different digital analysts and photographic experts to take a look at it, and no one can debunk it, but no one's also willing to go on record and saying it's authentic, as you can imagine. But they can't come right out and tell us 100% with certainty that it is fake.
Was that sighting like the day of the tragedy or days before?
If I'm not mistaken, it was literally the day of the tragedy and within minutes of the first plane hitting the first tower.
Okay. Wow. When I went down that rabbit hole and found that information, that led me to sightings like across the globe. And a lot of these sightings, as happened in Point Pleasant, seem to be leading to something. And in a lot of circumstances, it led to a natural disaster or tragedy, such as the collapse of the bridge. And we'll talk about that, outside the interview with our listeners, but and my co-hosts. But I was thinking about those people on the bridge and how terrifying that must have been as the bridge started undulating. And then you said there was like a sonic boom, a very loud sound, and then that happened. And for that much loss in a small town like that, like you said, the impact has gone on for decades afterwards.
It did. There's the psychological impact, and then we looked at the economic impact. As you mentioned, the Silver Bridge, it was the main thoroughfare connecting Point Pleasant with Gallipolis. And I'll tell you the story real quickly about how we found out the name. So all the drives up, we kept trying to figure out how to pronounce it because you see the signs for it. So it's like, is it Gallipolis? Is it, we had all kinds of variations on how it was pronounced. So one day we always stayed in that town. We stayed in Gallipolis. We stayed at the time it was called the Blue Fountain. I think now it's the Regency, but it's a motel, not even a hotel, but it was the motel that John Keel always stayed in when he was investigating in Point Pleasant. So to stay true to that connection, that's where we stayed. So we're there one morning. We've gotten up from the motel. We grabbed breakfast, and we had to stop and get gas. And there's a BP gas station right before you get back on the road taking you to the new Silver Bridge, or the Silver Bridge Memorial. And so we pull into the BP gas station, and it was one of those old-fashioned full service. They come out, and he was, he wanted to know how much we wanted, and so I told him everything, and he's doing the windows and checking the pressure in the tires and everything. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to solve this once and for all. So I get out of the car. I stand there, and I'm talking to the guy. He's an older gentleman, and I was like, sir, I said, can I ask you a question? I said, how do you pronounce where we are? And he looked at me for a second, studied me, and he said, BP. You got me. You got me.
He said, you ain't from around here, are you?
No. And he told me, he said, it's Gallipolis. Like, okay, thank you. That's what I needed to know.
For how many times he's gotten that on somebody.
I don't know. I couldn't believe I fell for it and walked into it. But
that's a good one.
What was my point telling us?
we were talking about the sonic boom and
the sonic boom,
and then you said that you all looked at the economical impact too.
Right, and the main thoroughfare being between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis. Well, when the bridge collapsed, it's literally like a 2-mile stretch over the Ohio River. Once that bridge collapsed, though, if you were on the Ohio side and you wanted to go to Point Pleasant, you had to drive 10 miles north, cross another bridge, and drive 10 miles south. So it was a 20-mile trip one way for what used to be a 2-mile drive. Same thing reverse if you're in Point Pleasant and you want to go to Ohio. Well, nobody's going to drive 40 miles for what used to be a 2-mile drive.
Right.
So what you found happening was, and when we got there, it's changed a little bit now, but when we were there in the early 2000s, all of the economic development was on the Ohio side. There was no Walmart in Point Pleasant. There were no franchise restaurants in Point Pleasant. It was all still locally owned, mom and pop. Restaurants, grocery stores, all of these were homegrown. So they had to find a way to survive. They had to find a way to make it. And they did, from 1967 until we were there in 2003, they had survived, they had persevered, and they had come back, and they were bouncing back, and they were rebuilding, and it's paid off. And they embraced the story of Mothman. They embraced the collapse of the bridge. They created the Mothman Festival in 2001, and that was spearheaded by Jeff Wamsley and Donnie Surgeon and Carolyn Harris and Charlie Humphreys and a few other people. But those were the core group that really spearheaded getting this thing off the ground, and it's grown and it's grown. And if you're ever looking for something to do that weekend in September, I encourage everybody that I ever talk to, every podcast I've ever been on, and anybody that I just talk to in general, if you ever are looking for something to do that weekend, take the trek to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's worth the drive. Everything there is free. It's a free street fair. The only thing you have to worry about buying is, getting a place to stay if you stay for the 2 days, or anything that you want to buy while you're there. Everything else is free. And there's lectures, and they show all the movies about Mothman, and they have UFO enthusiasts that are there. They have experts. Nick Redfern, a friend of mine, he regularly appears on Ancient Aliens with Giorgio Tsoukalos. Prolific author. He goes a couple of times a year. Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who passed away recently, she was a prolific author again, has been on Coast to Coast with George Noory several times. She would always be there and set up. And there's just all kinds of, you meet all kinds of interesting people from all over the world. So this little town of about 5,000 will sometimes triple in size on the weekend of the Mothman Festival. We'll go up to 10,000, 15,000, sometimes more. And there's people when we were there, it was like I said, we started going to the festival in 2005. I started speaking in 2006 and spoke 06, 07, 08, and 09. But we met people from Japan, we met people from Ireland, from Australia, from Spain, from the UK. I mean, it was just this really interesting mix of people that are all there because of their interest in exactly what we're talking about tonight, which is Mothman.
And now that's bringing tourism in, that's
Yes.
bringing dollars in. That's, yeah, I can see that would be a big boost to the local economy for sure.
Yeah. I actually did a presentation not long ago on taking the collapse of the Silver Bridge and the Mothman sightings and turning it into an economic development plan for tourism.
Oh, wow.
Because
Yeah.
they did, that's exactly what they did. They put the statue up. They embraced it. They bring people there. They love the film crews coming in. They love TV crews coming in. They love the media coming in. Social media influencers. They love it all, and it's become this thing on the internet now. If you have not had your picture taken with the Mothman statue, you are nobody.
Well, my daughter and son-in-law were there earlier this year and went to the museum and stopped and took some great pictures of the statue that we're going to throw up on social media. Um, as we were talking about the sighting of Mothman at the bridge that day of the collapse, do you think that these sightings had a direct connection with that bridge collapse, or it was some kind of predictor?
The conspiracy theorist in me wants to say there's a connection. I want to say that they're connected. The skeptic in me goes, that's just too easy. That's just life. Life doesn't work like that. It's kind of, it's that, Murphy's law. If it can go wrong, it is going to go wrong. And if the best laid plans of mice and men, we talk about these things, but then when something like this happens, we want to make all the signs and the symbols are there. We want to put everything pointing in that direction. That would be so neat. It would be so easy to do that. I honestly haven't found a direct connection between Mothman being in Point Pleasant and the collapse of the bridge. And I tried. I really tried to make those things fit and make that connection, but it's just not there. It would be like saying that Mothman and Indrid Cold and the Flatwoods Monster all had the same purpose, and there are some that argue that they did. There are some that will argue that all three of those are demonic. And actually, if I were going to say anything was demonic that was going on in Point Pleasant at the time, based on what I have researched about Indrid Cold, that particular event, that particular phenomenon that was taking place there, that has more earmarkings of something demonic and nefarious than the sightings of Mothman. And I've said recently, because everyone is, well, his eyes are red. I'm going, maybe he's just sleepy. Maybe his eyes.
I can relate.
We love projecting our beliefs and our ideals onto these things, and just because something's eyes are red doesn't make it demonic. And I always point out to people, they're like, well, but the Bible says demons' eyes are red. I said, no, it doesn't. I've read the Bible from beginning to end. I read every book. At one point in my life, I had memorized the entire 119th Psalm. It's the longest chapter of the Bible. It's the longest Psalm. It's 150 verses. Had it memorized from beginning to end. I've studied it. I've studied other religions. Nothing says that a demon's eyes are red. What the Bible does say in the book of Revelation is that the eyes of Jesus burn like embers. They burn like fire. So if we're going to go that direction, then literally the Bible says that Mothman, because of red eyes, could be angelic, not demonic.
Right.
It could be good. We love projecting these, like I said, our beliefs, our ideals, our preconceived notions onto all of these things, and we try to make them fit into our boxes. And that's why I always say, I love the supernatural and the paranormal, but I don't ever expect to find an answer. And that's one of the reasons I keep coming back, because if I find an answer, then I'm disappointed, because that's part of something being supernatural. I shouldn't be able to understand it. I shouldn't be able to explain it. It's supposed to exist out there in the ether, unexplainable, unattainable, but inspiring and intriguing and driving and making me want to find answers and making me want to dig deeper and making me want to gain understanding. And I gain understanding every single time. I never understand, but I gain understanding.
Right.
And those are two different things.
They are. Do you have any theories about why the sightings of Mothman kind of stopped in the area after the bridge collapsed?
I've made jokes about it. I'm like, well, maybe he just got tired of being accused of things. Maybe he just didn't want to be blamed for anything else that went wrong in Point Pleasant. Depending on who you talk to, there's a group of people that claim the sightings didn't stop, that they did continue. They were just not as prominent, they weren't as talked about, and they weren't as publicized. Now, to this day, I have never spoken to anyone in the town of Point Pleasant who has seen anything since then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've talked to people who are still there who saw things in 66 and 67, but no one who's seen anything after that date. And again, that's one of the reasons people draw that connection between Mothman and the collapse of the bridge. Well, his job was done. Was he there to warn people and nobody listened? Was he there to cause the collapse? Was he the Grim Reaper? Was he there to claim those 46 lives and take them to the other side? I have heard almost every possible theory and scenario that could be tossed about. And the honest answer at the end of the day is I do not have a theory. I can't draw any concrete evidence that points to any one reason why those two things happened at the same time and why one collapsed and one disappeared. So.
Well, let me ask you this. I've heard you recommend a number of books
Yes.
on the subject of Mothman. I'm reading Mothman Behind the Red Eyes right now and love it. Are there any other books or videos that you would want to give a shout out? You've said, hey, go to Point Pleasant, go see the Mothman Museum, experience the festival. Yep. That's all great. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to give a shout out and definitely let us know when your documentary comes back.
I will. Well, when it's out, I try to never take full ownership of the documentary. Like I said, Matthew worked on it, Charlie worked on it. I was just fortunate enough to be able to do the bulk of the research with Matthew. I wrote the script, I narrated, and then I was also the on-camera host. And I will say this: if you because you're going to play the intro at some point, right? From YouTube. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't know who that baby-faced SOB is anymore. When I look at that video of him walking up and talking, I don't know who that guy is. So when your viewers see it, I hope that they have the same. That can't possibly be the same person that was just on the show talking. You also have to understand, from the beginning of that shoot to the end of that shoot, I aged 6 years. The only thing that changes is my hair and my clothes. But it's just like it's from 6 years, 2003 to 2009 is how long it took to do each of those individual interviews and get everybody's schedule lined up. And then the recreations and the CGI and all of that. It was a fun 6 years. It was also very stressful, but it was a fun 6 years. I would thoroughly recommend Jeff Walmsley's books, Mothman Behind the Red Eyes and Mothman, I think Facts Behind the Legend, I think is the title of the second one. Nick Redfern has a great book out, and I'm drawing a blank on the title, and I don't have it at my desk. But it's I can send it to you. I'll send you the name of the book. But Nick Redfern's got a great one where he deals with monsters and cryptids all over the world, and he has several chapters about flying humanoids from Texas in the 1950s, from Vietnam during the 1960s, and they have very close similarities and very close ties to Mothman. But he also delves into Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and the Yeti and all of those things.
All the things right up our alley.
Exactly. And then the DVD series by Len Marzulli, The Watchers, I think he's up to, I was going to say 12 or 13, but he actually may be more than that now as far as the series that he has. But they're excellent, high quality production. Lynn had actually been part of Ancient Aliens for the first season he was interviewed, but his worldview and his ideology didn't match up with Prometheus production, so he was kind of pushed out of the project, and that's when he launched his own, where he was talking about UFOs and extraterrestrials the way he wanted to talk about them. And Lynn has a very, very hard line. This is demonic. UFOs are demonic. Extraterrestrials are demonic. Mm-hmm. The Mothman winged entities, they're demonic. He's kind of a very hard line approach of that, but very interesting, great Great author. I had the pleasure. I contributed a chapter to his book, The Luciferian Endgame. I did that back in 2008, 2009, I guess. Wrote a chapter on Mothman. I've contributed to 2 books by Bill Bean, The Spiritual Warrior. He's had me contribute chapters about Mothman in those books. And
he was
then,
on a podcast with you, wasn't he?
yes, he and I have done many together over the years. I co-hosted with him and Kev Baker. Kev passed away New Year's Day, 2021, 22. That switchover. So there's a couple of others. If I'd known that you were going to ask me about books, I would have gotten a list. And
That's okay. I know I put you on the spot there.
No, that's fine. I can send, because there are some really good ones out there. And there have been some really good documentaries that have been done since we did ours. I just always like to say we were first. So that's pretty much what we were shooting for, was to be the first to do a feature-length documentary. And we were able to do that and do it successfully. So it was a fun ride. Like I said, we got us on Coast to Coast with George Norrie 3 times for all 3 hours. So
wow.
First time it was each of us had an hour. Second time, Charlie and I divided up the time, and then the third visit, I was on with George for 3 hours, because it was it was right after John Keel had died, and it was in 2009. Because that was actually what really spearheaded the completion of the film. Was Keel died, Norrie put us on the spot, brought us on to talk about John Keel and Mothman and Dark Wings, and told everybody that it was going to be ready to sell at the Mothman Festival in September. This was like in July, so we had this huge crunch to finish the project in those 2 months left. So but we did, and it was great. But I did. That was one of the things we didn't talk about. I did have the distinct pleasure of getting to talk to John Keel on a couple of occasions, interview him on the phone when we were putting the documentary together. And again, there's so many things about Mothman. We didn't even touch into the Native American part of it with Chief Cornstalk. We didn't really look at the timeline of tragedy that we call it. So anytime you want to have me come back and we can pick up where the conversation has ended, I would be more than happy to do that.
That would be great. I can't wait to see what kind of response we're going to get from listeners. And if you want to send a list of the books or documentaries, movies, whatever, we can throw that up on our social media channels for them, and they can get that. But before we let you go, I have to ask you these 2 questions that I know our listeners are going to want to hear from you on.
Okay.
The first one is, are you still actively investigating Mothman?
By actively, I have not been back to Point Pleasant since 2000 and hang on, I've got to do the math. My daughter just turned 19 in July, so it would have been 2020. I took my daughter and her squad of girls up to Point Pleasant for a weekend. That's what she wanted for her 16th birthday. So I took them all up, got them all a hotel room. I got one down the end of the hall, but I took them all over Point Pleasant and showed them around, and they had a blast. That was the first time I'd been back to Point Pleasant since 2009. I do still continue to, as I said, follow Lon and what Lon's doing. I continue to research the 66, 67 sightings, because I don't think we've even scratched the surface of those sightings. And it is becoming imperative to talk to some of those people, because, we've lost Linda Scarberry. We lost Carolyn Harris in 2015 or 2016. She passed away. So we're starting to lose that voice. And that's one of the interesting things about Mothman, just real quickly, and I'll say this. There were no photographs of Mothman. There were no video footage of Mothman. There were no footprints. There was nothing like that. Mothman is unique, as far as I am concerned, in the world of the supernatural and the paranormal, and especially in cryptids, because in those original sightings, it's all eyewitness accounts. It's all narrative. It's all word of mouth, people telling what they saw, which I think is fascinating, because it's very true to the culture of West Virginia. It's very true to the Native American and the pioneer culture. It's the storytelling culture. We see something, we tell the story. And that, to me, was fascinating about Mothman. But yes, I still actively research it. Yes.
Okay. That is... in I think Jeff, is it Walmsley's book that I'm reading, Mothman Behind the Red Eyes? there are so many interesting newspaper clippings
Yes.
of stories, like pages and pages and pages of them. And I just enjoyed so much reading that. It
Yeah,
kind of makes it real, more real.
it does. It does. To see that other media outlets were picking it up and they're
Mhm.
covering it and were, reporting the story.
Yes. And the last question that I will ask you, you probably have anticipated it, but I know our viewers and I am curious to know what you thought about the movie that starred Richard Gere, Deborah Messing, and Laura Linney.
I absolutely loved it.
Did
It
you?
it, it
Okay.
is one of my favorite movies. Now, it's one of the I'm part of so many film groups on Facebook, and I get myself into so much trouble because I make statements and I make kind of hardline statements about movies. I like movies for different reasons. Mothman Prophecies, I think, was an amazing job of taking a story and mining through John Keel's book, because if you have not read it, it's stream of consciousness theater, because no chapters tie together. He's all over the place. You're with him, like in Tibet, and then you're back in Point Pleasant, and then you're in Manhattan, and you're just everywhere. And it's sometimes it's Andrew Cold, and sometimes it's Mothman. And so I think there's this really the directors and the producers and the screenwriter did an amazing job of taking a bunch of information and kind of coalescing it into what I basically call a 2-hour X-File, because that's exactly what it felt like watching. It was very
Mhm.
much Mulder and Scully.
I
The
agree.
the cinematography was great. The actors I think that they got were amazing. I thought it's probably one of my favorite Richard Gere roles outside of Primal Fear.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I loved it. I also have a huge crush on Deborah Messing, have since Will and Grace. So I mean, I like it for that. Um, but the only problem that I had with it, and there were two actually, and then one of them I got to reading, and one of them made sense, and I understand creative license. The biggest problem that I had with the movie was that they did intertwine the character of Mothman and Indra Cold too much.
Mhm.
They made them one and the same, and that is not the case. And I've had to go into several podcasts and kind of tear that apart and let people understand, these were happening at the same time, but they were happening to John Keel. He was getting those phone calls that Richard Gere's character was getting. He was
Mhm.
getting the chapstick phone call. He was getting those weird prophecy kinds of things while he was researching Mothman. But most of those calls were coming to him once he got back into New York at his apartment. So
Uh-huh.
they did take some creative licensing
Right.
there. And I don't think it's a bad creative license, but I think for those of us who know the Mothman story and who are really investigating it, it begins to make it difficult for us to explain how those things
Mhm.
don't really mesh up. They really shouldn't be combined. The other one that I have is that in the movie only 36 people die.
Oh, I've got to watch it again. I've seen it
Uh,
a couple of times, but it's been a while.
yeah, because Laura Linney's character, the police chief, in her dream, she keeps hearing someone say, "Wake up, number 37, wake up, number 37."
Mhm.
And I was wondering why they did, but the director chose to go with the number 37 because that was his football jersey when he was in high school. So he wanted to get just a little tie into himself in telling the story. So instead of making it, wake up number 47, it's wake up number
Yeah.
37. So then it changes the death toll from 46 to 36. So uh,
Mm.
but other than that, I thought it was a solid movie. I
Mhm.
watch it periodically. I'll just pull it out. I've got it on DVD.
Mhm.
And if I don't have my DVD player, then I'll just stream it. I love it. I think they did an excellent job with the storytelling.
Well, that is great. I am definitely going to watch it again. It's been a while since I have, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to finish my Mothman book I'm reading, and then I'm sure that this is a subject that I will just keep learning and keep learning and keep learning
Well,
about. It.
and
I
I
didn't
hope you
realize
do.
there was so much out there.
Oh, and it's actually taken a resurgence. And I would say honestly, and I'm not taking any credit for this, but it was post our release of Dark Wings, and there was just this resurgence in talking
Mhm.
about Mothman, and I really saw it started picking up. kind of during COVID, because I think people were trying to find things to read. They were trying to find things to watch. There's been a lot of news stories. Josh Gates has done things about Mothman and his stuff, and so it's kind of been all over the place, and it's good, because it's good for the town of Point Pleasant. It's good for businesses. It's good for tourism. So I'm glad for it, and I hope your listeners enjoy the subject and want to find out more, because it is absolutely fascinating when you start delving into it.
It really is. And thank you so much for enlightening us and sharing all this great information. We wish you well, and maybe we'll have you on again sometime and we can talk some more about it.
Just let me know when. I'm guest lecturing in the spring at East Tennessee State University for two lectures on Mothman. Is going to be one lecture, and then I'm lecturing on just all things paranormal and that go bump in the night on another lecture.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah, send info about that. My daughter actually lives very close to ETSU, so.
Well, I'm there 4 days a week, so you never know where you're going to catch me whenever we're doing one of these things. I could be in Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, who knows.
Well, that's our stomping grounds too, so maybe we'll run into you sometime. I do want to try to get to Mothman Festival for sure, and
I thoroughly encourage everybody to check it out. Mothman, and if you want, it's mothmanfestival.com, and you can find them on Facebook. So
awesome. Yeah, I can share that link for sure on our social channels. Well, thank you so much, Travis. We will let you enjoy your evening and have a great week. Thank you again for coming on talking to us.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Please be sure to join us next week, Friday, November 24th, for part 2 of the Mothman Chronicles. As Sirens Rhonda, Ryan, and Lindsay dive even deeper into the legend and lore behind the Mothman phenomena and share a few key takeaways from tonight's interview. The Sirens of the Supernatural podcast can be found on Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, and all other major podcast platforms. Join us each week for more spookiness. Also, we encourage you to join us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Sirens of the Supernatural, and on TikTok at Supernatural Sirens. Do you have a spooky story that you would like to share? Email them to us at sirensofthe-supernatural@gmail.com. Until next time, stay spooky.